brought to you by Insight Counseling Centers.
This is the Integration Podcast,
A podcast to discuss difficult but relevant topics
where issues of spirituality, psychology, the arts, and society all intersect. Hi, I'm Hannah Feliciano, a newbie therapist with a passion to work with underserved and minority populations. Over the years, I've loved serving others through taking mission trips to Mexico and Africa, working within the Hispanic community as a community organizer, and teaching ESL classes. I have a heart for the arts and at one point in my life studied to be a worship pastor. I've gone through my own personal journey through depression, anxiety, and chronic pain, which led me to where I am now, obtaining my degree as a marriage and family therapist to serve others in their own journey towards healing.
And I'm Eric Schaefer, and I've spent half my life outside the church and the other half working in a church setting as an ordained pastor in youth and family ministry and as a senior pastor. I love experiencing other cultures, and I've led over 100 short-term mission trips around the world to places like Scotland and Hungary and Belize and Molokai. I've also worked for Young Life in an inpatient adolescent psychiatric hospital. I have a film degree and a master's in Divinity. I love learning and experiencing God through relationships, the arts, and other cultures. All right, welcome everybody. Episode 2 of the Integration Podcast. There we go. This is Eric, and Hannah is with me today. How are you, Hannah?
I'm doing well.
Good.
It's good to be
Can you
here.
believe it? We made it to episode 2.
We made it.
I know. We're actually here. That was fun last time talking to those guys a little bit about the Insight Counseling crew, Carol and Dwight, about what exactly spiritually integrated therapy is. So, very cool. I thought maybe what we could discuss a little bit this time is more about that, what spiritually integrative therapy means to us. But before we do that, maybe back up a little bit. And I would love to hear your story, Hannah, just kind of who you are, how you got here, and how you decided to become a counselor and your faith background maybe a little bit.
Sure.
I'd love to hear all of that.
Yeah, well, that's a big topic,
Yeah,
but
it is.
it's definitely an important piece of, anybody's story. So I think a really big part of that is when I think about like family history and legacy and story, I think of my grandfather who was born in a little pueblito in Mexico, and he came to America when he was 17. He had a spiritual experience in Mexico where he converted to Christianity, and then he decided that he wanted to become a pastor. And so he came, and he always would tell his story like he's had like $5 in his pocket, came across, and everything was provided for him through people's just generosity and donations. And he studied in California and seminary, and then met my grandmother in Texas, where she was the daughter of a minister as well. And then they wrote each other letters. So they just met one time, wrote each other letters. That was their courtship. And he proposed to her, and then they moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Wow.
And they started the first Spanish-speaking Baptist church up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I still remember, even when I was younger, going there, and everyone would always be like, "Oh, you're, Eli's granddaughter," and just how important that was. And so, growing up, just remembering like family get-togethers, we would always, wait for Grandpa to say a prayer, and that was like a really important time. And we all knew that like having that respect for God, but also for him, was really important. But then for me personally, growing up, I always had this kind of connection to spirituality from a very young age. I was always just very, tenderhearted towards that, and it was important to me. And I still remember just like having that longing to know who God was, and to actually feel what that means in my life. My parents were, very religious or spiritual. They, both met through Campus Crusade for Christ. So that was a really big story for them. And then they were at an evangelical church, free church, and then they actually helped start like a church plant in a movie theater. So it was like doing drama and doing kids ministries and just being really involved. And that was kind of like my world. It was like this Christian bubble, but it was for the most part really, really good. And we were at this small church, so we didn't really have a youth group, so my parents kind of became that in the community. And I remember inviting kids over to our home and taking them on trips to go see concerts. But it was always just a time of exploration and, caring for others. And I think for the most part, it was a really positive thing for me. And, through my journey of faith, it has kind of evolved and changed over the years, but I think still, like, at its core, my heart to know God has always been there, and that hasn't ever really changed, even though maybe like the outward expressions sometimes have changed and have become a little bit different, but that's always been who I am. And I think that from a young age, seeing my grandpa care for people and bring people into his home and love people, and just that was kind of this model. And seeing my dad and my mom care for kind of that outcasts and the outsiders, that was always who I was too in high school, like befriending the loner and the kids who didn't have friends. And I see that kind of too as like this image of like who Jesus was as well. So that kind of has been my story, and I see that as a continuation too of this work that I do, is caring for those who are in really difficult places and have gone through some really bad traumas. And it's cool. I kind of also see it as full circle, that half of the population I serve are Latino, Hispanic folks who speak Spanish and maybe have never shared their immigration story and the trauma before with anyone. And it's such a sacred space to hold that and to be that for that person. And so I really just feel honored to be able to do the work I do. So.
Love that, Hannah. Is your grandfather and grandmother still living? Or
no, they did pass away.
They passed.
Yeah, they have passed away. But
did they know, though, that you were on this path maybe with counseling and to kind of...
They passed away before I started
okay.
the counseling work. But when I first moved to Nashville, I worked at a Hispanic community center. And so that was something I was doing. And they knew about that work, and they knew about the many missions trips I've taken to Mexico. And I know that my grandma would always write me like a handwritten note and send a check and just always just tell me how much she was so proud of me for carrying on that legacy to care for other people. So.
And I love that you're honoring them with your own twist and doing it with your own passion and your own gifts and talents, but carrying on now 3 generations of work and faith. And I love that. Well, Hannah, we met, how long has it been? Maybe 6 months ago, something like that? Maybe a little
about
longer
that.
than
maybe
that.
A little bit longer.
And first of all, thank you for sharing that. And I'll share a little bit about myself as well. But we've been talking about the importance of and the change. Even you just mentioned 3 generations and how faith is lived out and what an amazing story. Starting California, Texas, and then up to Wisconsin, and
now
the
Tennessee.
Baptist background. Now here you are in Nashville, exactly. And so time changes and places change, but faith and the search for God continues in your family and certainly in my family as well. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I'm just going to hit a couple snippets. I grew up in South Florida, in North Palm Beach, and my parents, great family. I have an older sister as well. We weren't really church people. It was great morals and ethics and all that, but church wasn't at the forefront of our life. And so kind of the big moment in our family was happened when I was, I think 9 or 10, and my mom had breast cancer and quickly moved through her body, and she passed away within probably start to finish a year, maybe less. And so for me, for teenage years, some of the things I was picking up with the things that you were talking about is a God that cared about you, that you felt a connection with, and community. I didn't have any of that. And so my view is more of maybe as an agnostic, just, okay, I can get it that there's probably a creator, but somebody who cares about me or loves me even didn't really make a lot of sense, because my family kind of got ripped apart and I was kind of just left going, gosh, what just happened? So I kind of took the opposite approach, made fun of Christians who carried their Bibles to school, and I was very sharp-tongued and sarcastic, and so I was able to pick apart their views on things, and then this crazy church in North Palm Beach. They didn't really do anything that well. It was a small church. And so they got this great idea. They said, you know what, why don't we hire some people from just fresh out of college? So actually there was a guy from Vanderbilt, who I'll talk about in a few minutes, and others that they hired, and they gave him a very small amount of money. And they said, listen, really nothing much is happening at the church. So why don't you just go and start meeting kids around the community and see what happens? And so that's what happened. And so they did. And so there was youth groups and all those kind of things. Frankly, I wasn't even that involved. I wasn't involved at all as far as the church goes. But this one intern from this church would come to my house. We had a full court basketball court in our backyard. And I'm a big, tall guy. And so I play basketball, and that was my thing. And he would just come over and play basketball with bunches of guys who would just hang out after school and in the evenings and played with lights up and the whole 9 yards. So it was really through that relationship and him speaking to me and getting to know me, and just a few years older than me. He was, fresh out of college, and his allowing me to speak and ask questions, and difficult questions, and how can a loving God let stuff like happen to me or my mom happen, and all those kind of things that I was feeling. He was the first person that ever listened, number one. Number two, cared enough to try to come up with some answers. And number three, kind of share with me that maybe there was something more out there than just a God that plopped us all on earth and disappeared, And so from that, and then through really ultimately Young Life, which really was the model that this church was using. They didn't call it Young Life, but it was just kind of this relational approach to faith and to ministry, is how I came to know God and know Jesus through this ministry, kind of like almost 2 steps removed. And so really, Hannah, my life's journey has been a couple things. One is to honor my mom. That is a lot of what I wanted to do in my work. And two is to kind of recreate for other kids and other people of all ages what this person, his name is Steve Haynes, did for me. And so I've done that all over the place. I've spent most of my adult life in California. And so maybe we can hit a little bit on that today, talking about what young people, you're younger than me, probably young enough to be my daughter. And so this is great because we're coming at it from different generations. But I spent tons of time working with millennials, who, youth group kids. I've been in youth ministry in some sort, probably 15, 20 years. So when I say kids, that could be all the way up to 35 now, because they were teenagers when I first started. But what have you noticed, or what are the changes happening these days? I'll ask some big questions, and then you can just pick which one you want. What is church going to look like in the future? Where is faith? Where's spirituality? And these are the questions I hope that we can tackle in this podcast. Honestly, So have at it.
Yeah. Well, I do think it is changing. It's been changing. I think people are kind of tired with kind of like rote answers and kind of things that they've just been always told, and kind of just going through the motions of like, you go to church, you go to worship, you listen to the message, and you just take it for what it is. I think people are wanting to interact in a more meaningful way and really wrestle through some really tough questions. And I think people are finding places to do that are even outside of church, like different communities, either online or just, in person, but having those difficult questions and not being looked at like you're crazy and like, why are you thinking that? And kind of this, overarching theme that even I see, and kind of people throw this word out a lot, but it's kind of like the idea of deconstructing your faith.
Mm-hmm.
That means that you have to have a faith to begin with.
Right.
So you've started with something, you have this faith that you've kind of been given or you've come to know, but then you come to a point where you're like, but is this really what I believe? And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I fully like jive with everything that I'm hearing anymore. And so you start to kind of pick apart and really ask those deeper questions. But I think it's such a beautiful process, because in the unraveling, then you can also find a place to reconstruct and figure out, well, what does this mean now for me? And I'm looking at this faith with maybe fresh eyes and not just taking it for what I've been handed, but actually engaging with it. And I feel like a lot of people are kind of in that place, I'm kind of in and around a lot of like evangelical
Mm-hmm.
circles. Like that's where I started. And then, so there are people who even call themselves like ex-evangelical, or because they're not just wanting that, like, believe in Jesus and you're good, like that quote unquote, like fire insurance,
Mm-hmm.
but looking for something deeper, like wrestling with those tough questions, and it being okay that there's ambiguity, being that it's okay that there's gray, that it's okay that you can not know. And I mean, at least for me and for people I interact with, I feel like that's kind of where a lot of young people in my generation kind of are right now.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and I've experienced, I would say, the same thing. I as I was mentioning, I was on the west side of LA, and it's one of the wealthier communities, really in the country, and the teenagers there, like I said, now some of them are now well into their 20s and 30s, but really most of them were not attending church. It was spirituality was a part of their life, like you were talking about, but they didn't, I'm not even sure they were deconstructing yet, because they were still kind of forming, but
Sure.
so many of the families were mixed. It could be Jewish Christian marriages, or just really no background.
Yeah.
And so kids were searching, and I was. So it was such a challenge, because you go, okay, well, there's really nobody. Kids aren't really going to church in this community. So what do we do here? How do we approach this? And so I as I shared with my background, a lot of what I did was I just went out and started meeting kids and hanging out with them wherever they were, in sports fields and wherever else. And there really were 2 or 3 things, I think, that were lines that most of the kids seemed to connect with. And one was just genuine relationships, was to be known and to be heard, and to be in a connection with other people, feeling like an adult listened to them, or whatever the case was. And I think that was something that was really important. And then there was this experiential side. So this idea of like sitting in a Sunday school class, or really honestly even like a worship service, just it didn't really resonate. Nobody was doing it. Their parents weren't even doing it. And so it wasn't just creating new experiences, but it was new experiences that provided some sort of meaning in their life. And so, a lot of time I don't know, old school, when you think of like mission trips or service trips or whatever, you think, oh, well, you have to go through this or get confirmed in a church, or you have to, know the Bible inside and out. And that was not going to work, because most of the young people that I were working with weren't doing any of those things. So we just said, fine, we'll give it a go and see what happens. And so we would, I love experiential trips. And when I say mission trips, everybody has a different definition of what that is. But for us, at least the way it started was, let's get as many people as we can together. And we would drive down to Tijuana, Mexico, kind of on the outskirts. And there was cardboard cities out there. People live in cardboard boxes, and they come into the factory and make, not very much, $10 a week or something like that to support their families. So we would go in and we'd build two-room houses for an entire family. And we would hand mix the cement, and we would have blueprints, and we would, all of us who didn't know anything about carpentry or anything, we would build houses literally within a week. And these families would move in, and we'd work side by side with them, and we would get to know them and speak Spanglish with them and all the things that you do. And we'd kick soccer, but we didn't have soccer balls, so we used a liter Coke bottle to play soccer. And a crazy thing happened. All these very well-off white kids were like, wait a second, what's going on down here? We have better relationships. People come and cook food for us down here, and I don't even know my neighbor back in the city that I live in, and they start hanging out. And then you say, well, let me read some things from the Bible. And then suddenly those stories come to life, because it was meaningful and it was experiential. And this idea that we were doing things and with a heart of justice, where people who maybe are being treated unfairly or have been rejected, this is just part of who a lot of millennials, I guess you call them, are, which is just, that is what is meaningful for them. And so then it was almost like, Hannah, like spirituality or faith came in through experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it's one thing to be told a story or read a story, but it's another thing to go live that story and to meet people. Like a lot of times it's just people don't have any exposure to people who are different than them, kind of like the other. And I mean, I just go back to that, like, who was Jesus hanging out with? He was hanging out with the other. And that it's like, once you have an experience and you see that and you meet that person and you talk with that person and you hear their story face to face, it changes you. It just does. And you can't go back. You can't ever be like you were before. And I think that is, that's where change happens inside of us. And I think, we're probably here because we've had some of those experiences. We've looked into eyes of people that have experienced so much loss, and yet they have so much hope. Or, I still, remember meeting some women who were mothers in an orphanage in Africa, and her sharing her story with me, and just, realizing that for her in her life, when she lost everything and she asked God, like, please provide for me today my daily bread, like, I don't even have food. And then she was able to, find this organization that took her in and took her children in and fed her and clothed her and met her where she was at and met her needs. That was her experience of, okay, this is God, but it's so much bigger than we can fathom sometimes or understand. But when you have those experiences, when you meet those people and you are with them, it's like, those are experiences I'll never forget that changed me. And I think that's probably part of the reason I do this work.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think what I did, we would take all kinds of these trips, service trips and mission trips. And what I realized, what you just said was dead on, which was did we ever help anybody? I don't know. Maybe we did, but we all came back so changed because there was this connection, like you said. And I call them kind of God moments where even as you were talking and just watching you, that moment you had with that young lady, it was bigger than just the talk. There was a connection there that was genuine, that was almost otherworldly in a sense. So then that is, it seems like, where God's Spirit seems to move in very powerful ways. And what we would see, even with what you just shared, is then these teenagers would come back from these trips. Again, they knew just maybe a handful of verses, maybe a little bit about Jesus, and yet they would come back and they would transform their families because they're like, you know what, we're going about this all wrong. This is not who I want to be anymore. Is this materialistic, driven person? I want to, care about relationships. I want to consider reconciliation and communication in our family. All these kind of things that they had kind of experienced on trips. So. Again, it's that genuineness, it seems like, what people are craving when they talk about their spirituality. Hannah, earlier you were talking about deconstruction, reconstruction. Maybe tell me a little bit about what that means to you, or maybe even give me some examples of what exactly that is, even in your own life or what you've seen with friends and other folks.
Yeah, I think for me, it's kind of been a process of perhaps, growing up, you see things as a certain way, and maybe they're more black and white. And as you get older and you have different experiences, you meet different people, you realize that everything doesn't fit neatly into a box, and neither does God and what that entails.
Right.
So for me, I think it's been kind of a journey that I'm still on, but realizing that, things that maybe I thought were just like exactly this way aren't maybe exactly that way. And I know I'm kind of being vague, but it's, I guess, realizing that, for instance, like understanding the Bible, that it can be very different than maybe what I grew up believing, but there's still like the essence that I still believe in. Because a lot of times you're just taught one thing and then you're expected, you kind of regurgitate that. But what does it really mean to really wrestle with that and not just take it for what it is? And I think you kind of have to go through that to come out the other side and be comfortable with, maybe it looks a little bit different now. Maybe I'm walking out my faith in a little bit different way. It's not just about like going through the motions or going to church or like kind of like saying that prayer and being okay. But it's really about like, connecting with the divine. And that can be done through a multitude of ways, and it can look different for different people. And I think just being open to that and being open to the fact that God can meet people however he meets them. I think Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest, he talks about like kind of all these branches on a tree and kind of that different ways people kind of connect to God in their own way. We're all in the same earth, and all the branches go up in this and cross over. And that's kind of this picture of how people are connected to God. And I just think it's so much bigger than just maybe one way of thinking or one way of believing, because I think it makes it more beautiful, actually, kind of like all of it together instead of just like this one way of believing or one way of thinking. And I guess when I've kind of, in my own life, when that kind of started getting peeled back and I started accepting that, it made it just more beautiful and more mysterious. And that's kind of been the journey that I've been on. So
Yeah. So one of the things that I love about insight counseling that initially attracted me to be a part of this organization is this idea where what you just said, if you had to leave your faith or your spiritual side in the waiting room before you walked into, let's say you were the client instead of the therapist, it would be, to me, it would just be half of really who you are. It would almost be a disconnect if the therapist didn't at least understand or include that in what was happening in your therapy. So now let's flip to the other chair. So now you're sitting on the other side. Maybe talk a little bit about, I think probably the biggest question that I get working here is like, oh, is this Christian counseling, or is this just ministers giving Bible verses for you to talk about? Or so this integrated counseling, which I think is, to me, really the future of counseling. Just maybe talk a little bit about how you approach it. I think everybody does it a little bit differently, but what resonates with you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it definitely starts with respecting where my client is at personally. So some clients come in and, they'll say like, I have some idea of spirituality, but I'm not really a religious person.
Yeah.
But I'll still kind of explore what that means to them and how that, maybe there was like songs that they, grew up hearing that still kind of tug at them because there's this part of them that was resonated with that. I had a client who, they were going through a grieving process, and a song that was sung to them in their childhood resonated with them, and I had her sing it, part of it, in session. And that to me is a spiritual moment, connecting to a part of yourself that's not just talking. I think that was so beautiful, and it kind of unlocks a memory that kind of then helped her heal from some of that from the past. And then I have clients who are very much so Christian and want to talk about their faith, but sometimes I hold it and give them a different perspective of how maybe they're looking at something, and really holding that to help them kind of come into the gray, which is interesting. So sometimes, honoring their belief, of course, but then, helping them think about it in a different way. And I always think if a spiritual tenet or faith or practice or belief isn't serving you in a healthy way, then really examine why it's there. Really examine why this is a part of my life. And I think we need to think about that. We need to have those like hard conversations with ourselves. And so sometimes that's what I'm doing, is just kind of holding up that mirror and letting them hear what they say, so that they can be like, wait a second, do I really believe that? Or was that something that maybe I was just taught over and over, and so I thought it's what I had to believe? And that's really kind of an amazing experience, sitting with clients and helping them kind of unravel that and finding their core self, which is definitely a spiritual experience. So
I love that, Hannah, and I love this idea of you don't come in with an agenda, which is the person, the client who comes in. They wade into whatever level of depth or faith or spirituality or whatever their background is, how much, and you let them take the lead rather than, I think probably my stereotype when you think of this is, oh my gosh, you're going to be, of maybe even back to what I thought of God when I was younger, the judge in the sky who is counting up all the wrongs, or whatever it is, and yet this is such a completely different way to experience and grow in faith, and do that in a one-on-one setting, and maybe that's not too different than the stuff your grandfather was doing, just in a different way,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I've actually had a client tell me before, like, I wasn't sure what I was getting into when I saw, that it was pastoral counseling, or that, spiritually integrated care. And then they were like, but this is really awesome, and I appreciate that you respect where I'm at, and that was really paramount. Like, just doing education in the session about what it is, that it's not about me telling you what to believe at all, but it's about me, exactly what you were saying, meeting you where you are at, and honoring that journey, and walking alongside that client wherever they may be.
Well, I know we're going to be discussing in upcoming podcasts. We're going to try to have some different guests who really from all faith backgrounds, but I know even some of the stuff you incorporated where we talk about music is a big deal, and it certainly has been for me. Music is, for me, God's language in a lot of ways, and helps me to connect. Relationships is a big deal as well. I don't know. Any other last thoughts before we sign off here on this exciting topic?
Well, one of my favorite quotes, actually, bringing back Richard Rohr.
Yeah.
He says, all true spirituality is about what you do with pain. Either you transform your pain, or you will transmit it to those around you.
Wow.
And I really think that that's kind of it. It's allowing that wound to be healed so that you can go out and heal others. And kind of, again, full circle. I know we talked about this a little bit last time, but that wounded healer imagery, and that was one thing that really struck me when I first heard that. I was like, yeah, that's what I want to do. And I think it's so much deeper than that. It's like, that's who I am. And I think that's like, when you've been touched at that deep level, you can't help but go and want to heal.
Yeah. And I can tell you that in my background and my experience, when people are in a place where they feel complete trust and have the ability to share pain and share their true identities. And, I'm sure you've seen this even in therapy. It isn't necessarily even that you have some incredible insight. Yeah. It's just that you are there with them to walk through that piece. And that, I think we both kind of hit on that today. The initial story that I told of just being able to share the pain of losing my mom at a young age with somebody, it shifted something inside me. And like I said, it really is supernatural. I don't even know exactly what happened, but just to have somebody walk through that with me allowed me to shed my sadness and my anger and my rage, and turn it into something that exactly what you said, where I can say, you know what, I'm going to honor my mom instead of tearing everybody down around me. I'm going to help kids who have lost parents, or and it doesn't even have to be because they passed away. It could have been through divorce or through some sort of broken relationship. And I can tell you, just year after year of I'm not even sure why, but I would look around the room, and most of the kids who were in the room were connected because they had lost a parent one way or another, either through, like I said, divorce or hurt or something like that. And so it was in the pain of sharing that together, that we came out stronger on the other side.
Yeah.
And that is where like you said, and that quote is amazing, that is where I've found God's healing touch has impacted me, I think, the most. So
yeah, it's the power of presence.
Yeah.
Really being with.
Yeah.
Just honoring what that person's story is so important. That's been, I think, the people that make the most impact and have made the most impact in our lives are the people who showed up. And I just keep going back to that idea of presence, being with another and alongside with that other person. And I think when that happens, that's when it is definitely a sacred space. It's a spiritual moment, and we don't always know why or what, but you go and you leave and you're different. And so, yeah, just making room for those types of interactions.
No, and it's fascinating, again, with the groups that I have worked with. Some of the denominational fights that seem to be going on over liturgy or who can be ordained and no one cares about that. With the folks that they don't even know about it, because they wouldn't even go into a setting, a organized church setting like that, because it seems so petty. Because the justice piece, which is, you know what, we want to help people who don't have voices. We want to help people who have been marginalized. We want to connect ourselves. We want to share our pain and be heard and to hear other people's pain. And so it seems like then the religion piece, there's no room for it, or people, it's so far down the list on importance that an argument over the exact definition of a theology, like you were talking about earlier, it doesn't resonate maybe with folks that are reconstructing, because they realize that is just not that important in their own lives,
Yeah, it has to have real meaning. It can't just be words on a page. It has to actually make a difference and touch them in a way that actually is going to impact how they live. So thank you so much for just taking this time and sharing your story too, Eric, and giving a space for me to remember some of my story and, share those places in my life that have meant a lot. I think that's so important, and I'm excited that we have this place to do this and invite other people to be involved in that, however that means. If you don't want to share it publicly, but share with someone, find someone to sit down with and maybe ask those questions about what their faith background is or what spirituality means to them, to find places in your life to seek that deeper meaning and connection. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Hannah. Integration Podcast is sponsored by Insight Counseling Centers, restoring lives to wholeness, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, through quality and compassionate counseling services for individuals, families, and couples across Middle Tennessee.